Nick Smith.
And Mr Speaker, it's always a pleasure to follow David Parker because he is a member that wants to engage in the House and makes a thoughtful contribution. But I would challenge him in reflecting on a time when as many of New Zealand's core economic statistics, those vital signs that say how well we're doing, look as good, because I have to say, as a member of 25 years, if I look at those core figures of GDP, growth, interest rates, unemployment, I would challenge members of this House to tell me a time when New Zealand was doing better. Let's go through them. Economic growth. Well, the member says under Labor. Well, let's see how well that member's connected to the real world. Because one of the issues for families is the cost of living, how much it's going up each year. And one of the reasons that members opposite got biffed out in 2008 was the cost of living was going up by 5% per year. It's no good getting a wage increase, I say to the member opposite, of 3% if your costs are going up by 5%. And do you know what the inflation figures are, Mr Speaker, for the last year? 0.1%. The lowest level in 23 years. And that's good news because that means that families' costs of their power bills, their food bills, all those other costs are constrained and are going up by diddly squat. And then you look at a figure like wage growth, because the real gain we need to make in our community is that wages are going up faster than the cost of living. And wages have gone up by 2.4% in the last year, and significantly yesterday, the Prime Minister announced that the minimum wage is going up by an additional 50 cents per hour. That's a growth of 3.4%. And it's not one of those increases of 3.4%, it's real because inflation is so low. And then an area that's so relevant to housing. What's interest rates that families are paying, that businesses that are paying, that farmers are paying are at the lowest level, Mr Speaker, in 50 years. Why does that matter? Well, actually, if you're a family out there in New Zealand trying to pay the mortgage, we now have banks that are offering interest rates at less than 4%. And I say to members opposite, when was the last time you picked up a newspaper and a bank would offer you an interest rate of less than 4%? And why does it matter to the economy? Because if you're a business out there, and I was visiting them in my own electorate last Friday, and they were looking at investing an extra $2 million in a processing facility for fruit in my electorate, actually, interest rates is the difference between investing in that additional equipment for that export industry and rather than not. And of course, I think all members would agree that one of the core economic statistics is the level of unemployment. And we know in the last figures coming down from 6% down to 5.3% that New Zealand has one of the highest labour participation rates, highest level of jobs anywhere in the OECD. Now we can argue figures and quote them all we like. Actually, you know one of the most important signals of how well our country is doing is the fact that everybody's got a choice to get on a plane and leave this country. And I'd remind David Parker, if New Zealand was so great under the Labor government years between 2000 and 2008, why were there 35,000 bright, talented young New Zealanders who chose to vote with their feet and take their talent elsewhere? And what we see in contrast today is a record period of actually New Zealanders coming home. That's putting some pressure on my job as Minister of Housing, but I say I welcome it. I welcome that our country is doing so well that more migrants and more New Zealand citizens are choosing to make New Zealand their home. I also want to, Mr Speaker, reinforce the message that this is a government that's making real progress on the issues that are of concern around those New Zealanders that are most struggling. I mentioned earlier the issue of the lift in the minimum wage. I remind the Parliament that on the 1st of April, there is going to be the first increase in core benefits in 43 years. Now, why can't members opposite that plead so much, that moan and whinge as though they're exports, acknowledge that this government is providing that significant increase, not just in core benefits, but even for those people on low incomes with families and giving them additional support? And I look at the early childhood participation figures, the best our country has ever had. I look at the performance of health and the best child immunisation rates that we have ever had, and they are part of a picture of a country that is doing well. But the responsibility of a government is not just to deliver and to do well, it's to have a forward program, and that is some of the things that I want to talk about in respect of my own portfolio. I was fascinated at the questions today around the issue of home insulation, because I pointed out in the 9 years of the previous government, they did an average of 2,000 homes were insulated each year. I think we in this parliament all agree that getting those older homes built before 1978 that did have insulation is a good thing. But I do have to challenge members opposite, is when your record was doing 2,000 homes per year, it's rather difficult to describe a bill that will require 60,000 homes per year to be insulated is somehow mean and inadequate. It is simply not credible. And I also was interested in the Greens, criticising this government and saying, oh, it's just all greenwash. How can you describe the largest area of ocean protection in the world, an area twice the size of the land area of New Zealand, that this government is committing to global marine conservation, an area of the second deepest ocean in the world, an area where there are over 50 different marine species, over 6 million birds, and the legislation that we will be bringing into this House, consequential to the Prime Minister's announcement at the United Nations in creating that Kermadec Ocean Sanctuary, is a part of this government's program that reinforces we are a blue-green government. We're a government that wants to grow the economy but also do the right thing by the environment. The last point I want to make in this debate is I have never been in the parliament in which opposition parties have had so many contradictory positions. You know, we started the year, and I remember, if we make the equivalent time, on the issue of the TPP. And I say to the members opposite, I still don't quite understand their position. I know in my constituency where there's going to be a reduction in tariffs on fish, there's going to be a reduction in tariffs on exports of processed forest products, where I know there's going to be a reduction in the tariffs on the products that we export, like the kiwi fruit, like the apples, like the berry fruit. And meeting with those industries, they are so encouraged about that and the capacity for them to be able to grow, employ more people and pay more to people. Then why is it that members opposite are so opposed to those fruit, those forestry, those meat, those dairy industry gains that have been so successfully negotiated in the TPP? And I see some Labor members are in favour, some are opposed, and I cannot understand the confusion. And then we take a core issue, and there's been a bit of debate today about the issue of debt. Again, I have to say I'm confused. I listened to Grant Robertson, and he says the government needs more stimulus. It needs to borrow more and stimulate the economy. And then the next minute I hear another Labor member, David Parker, express concerns and to say, oh, the government's borrowing too much. Well, you can't speak out of both sides of your mouth. You need to have a clear position. And then we come to the issue of housing. And David Parker, in the speech that was just given, said the government needs to go harder on the Auckland Council and make sure that there is intensification. Well, actually, only last week, Phil Twyford was saying that government was interfering and bullying the Auckland Council to try and get intensification. Well, is David Parker right, or is Phil Twyford right, or is this just another case of Labor all over the paddock and not knowing what they stand for? I equally point out the area of social housing, where I compliment the work that Paula Bennett and Bill English is doing. And I see them railing in the House riling in their electorates opposed to the transfer of state houses over to community housing providers, and then stand on platforms with Phil Twyford when he says to the community housing organisation he supports the transfer of state houses over to those community housing providers. Mr. Speaker, I know of no time in my time in this House when we have faced an opposition that has such a confused position as what they stand for. They are a party that has lost their way. It is no surprising that they are polling so badly. They are so far from being a credible government because they do not know, Mr. Speaker, what they stand for.